Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan selamat pagi.
Saya akan membacakan biodata ringkas penceramah. Dr. Mazlan adalah lulusan bidang geologi dari Universiti Southampton dan sarjana daripada Universiti Malaya dan Earth Sciences daripada Oxford University dan pernah berkhidmat dengan Petronas selama 33 tahun daripada 1984 hingga 2017. Selepas bersara dari industri petroleum, beliau dilantik sebagai penasihat kepada projek Pelantar Benua Malaysia di bawah Majlis Keselamatan Negara dari tahun 2017 hingga 2023 dan dilantik sebagai ahli Suruhanjaya Had Pelantar Benua Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf CLCS selama 2 penggal dari tahun 2012 hingga 2023 dan beliau juga merupakan Fellow Akademi Sains Malaysia sejak 2013 dan merupakan mantan Presiden Persatuan Geologi Malaysia dari 2014 hingga 2017. Tanpa berlengah masa lagi, saya serahkan majlis ini kepada Dr. Mazlan.
Assalamualaikum. Selamat pagi. Terima kasih kepada UKM dan JSM kerana menjemput saya beri sedikit taklimat mengenai geologi dan pelantar benua dalam Undang-Undang Laut. Sebenarnya saya baru je tamat kontrak dengan MKN 15 bulan itu. Sama juga date tamat jadi member dalam Commission on Limits of Continental 15 Jun 2023. Jadi kira dah macam bersara lah. Jadi mungkin ini hari yang tepat untuk saya just explain apa dia pelantar benua, continental shelf, macam mana geologi, bidang geologi digunakan dalam Undang-Undang Laut. Yang khasnya Undang-Undang Laut yang saya sebutkan ni Undang-Undang Laut Antarabangsa dikenali sebagai United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Ini macam kira perlembagaan laut. Jadi semua negara yang ratify this convention obligated to follow the rules and regulation according to this document. Antara salah satu perkara ialah continental shelf atau dalam bahasa Malaysia pelantar benua. Malaysian Continental Shelf Project yang diterajui oleh Majlis Keselamatan Negara, dia punya mandat dia untuk membuat tuntutan bagi pihak Malaysia untuk pelantar benua atau continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, maknanya lebih daripada 200 batu nautika daripada pantai. Mengikut convention ni, according to this convention, any coastal state, maknanya negara yang berpantai layak untuk menuntut continental shelf yang lebih daripada 200 batu nautika dari pantai. Jadi itu je tujuan Malaysian Continental Shelf Project. Nanti saya akan explain sedikit sebanyak apa dia CLCS, Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. So in the press, we sometimes see news about continental shelf, the claims made by Malaysia, for example, in recent years. The last submission that Malaysia made to the CLCS was December of 2019, and there's been some activity in the media talking about the claim made by Malaysia, very controversial and so on. So I think it's good in the sense that awareness about continental shelf is a bit low among the Malaysian public. I think people are starting to get interested in the subject. And for that reason, I wrote an article in Malay in Berita Harian during the COVID time, just after the Malaysian submission was made in 2019, to explain the basics of what is meant by continental shelf atau pelantar benua dari segi Undang-Undang Laut. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the basics of what is continental shelf from the standpoint of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Why is it important? Why there is maybe some controversy. So I will cover all these aspects. In this convention, there are maybe 300 articles or more, but we are focusing on Article 76 of UNCLOS. Just one article, which contains only 10 paragraphs, but it creates a lot of controversy as well. So Article 76 is about a continental shelf. And then I will speak about what is the purpose of the submission, what is the process of making a submission, and the consideration by the CLCS. So as I mentioned, Malaysia is one of state parties that ratified the convention in 1996. So all state parties of the countries in the United Nations that ratified the convention, that means you agreed to abide by the convention that was negotiated for many years until 1982 to become the sort of the constitution of ocean. So basically this diagram summarizes in essence, what do we mean by continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles? Under the convention, just to simplify, if you have a land territory, they say Malaysia, what is beneath the sea beyond the shoreline is continental shelf. As we geologists mostly understand continental shelf, the shallow sea, the seabed, mostly less than 200 meters water depth. But that continental shelf will become, as you go seaward, will be the continental slope. And somewhere at the base of that slope is what is defined in the convention as the foot of the slope. That means a particular point is defined in the convention at the base of the slope. And also the convention defines that there's a 200 nautical mile limit from the baseline, the 200 nautical mile limit, which defines the area what we call as the exclusive economic zone, EEZ, zone economic exclusive. The point of EEZ is that the coastal state is given the sovereign rights to engage in economic activity within that 200 nautical mile zone, exclusive to the coastal state. That means even if you, let's say, the coastal state doesn't go fish in that 200 mile zone, no other state can come in and take the fish because it's exclusive, it's defined as exclusive. Now, continental shelf is not about the water column, it's about the seabed and what's beneath the seabed. The term is seabed and subsoil. So it's only concerned with the seabed and subsoil. Now, extended continental shelf, which is the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, is only the seabed beyond 200 nautical miles. So Article 76 provides the coastal state to have an extended continental shelf, that means extended from the normal beyond 200 miles, if the coastal state can prove with geological, hydrographic data and so on, that the continental margin extends beyond the 200 nautical miles. That means the 200 nautical miles is a given. Anything on the seabed that is up to 200 nautical miles is the exclusive jurisdiction of the coastal state. But if the coastal state can prove with scientific data that the continental margin extends beyond 200 nautical miles, this is what we call the so-called extended continental shelf, or continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. And in order to do that, the coastal state has to submit the information, the supporting scientific data, to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, a body of 21 members made up of experts like geologists and geophysicists and hydrographers to examine the data and recommend what is the outer limit of the continental shelf for the coastal state. And why is it important? Because once that outer limit of the continental shelf is defined, let's say this time, what is left beyond that outer limit is what is under the convention called the area with capital A. There's a part 4 of the convention that deals with area. That means the seabed that lies beyond the outer limit of the continental shelf. Why is it important? Because that area, the seabed, is governed by another body in the United Nations system called the International Seabed Authority. So any economic activity that will be done in the area, which is beyond the outer limit of continental shelf, will be governed by the International Seabed Authority. And the one principle that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea specifies is that this area, the resources on the seabed, is the common heritage of mankind. That means it belongs to no one, but it belongs to everyone. In a sense, the International Seabed Authority manages the area on behalf of all the states. Just to remind, 1 nautical mile is about 1.8 kilometers. In this presentation, capital M is nautical mile. So that is, in essence, what I'm going to talk about. I might be repeating along the way. So that's basically it. What is extended continental shelf? And as I mentioned, it uses concepts in geology and adapts it to be used for the purpose of the convention. I will touch a bit on what Article 76 says, because it's a legal document. You need to understand the language that is in the document. So Article 76, paragraph 1 defines what is a continental shelf. And I just highlight, we don't need to read everything. I just highlight in red the main concept of what is a continental shelf. And it says the continental shelf is the natural prolongation of the land territory. Natural prolongation. The concept is very important because when I wrote the Berita Harian article, I was thinking about in Malay, how we approach the problem. Who owns the ocean? Siapa yang miliki lautan? Intuitively, we think about when you own the land territory beyond the shoreline, there must be a zone that belongs to you as well. By virtue, kerana kita memiliki tanah yang jajahan, territory. So, under the convention, what we call territorial sea is 12 nautical mile from the baseline, the shoreline, 12 batu nautika. The concept of natural prolongation maknanya orang yang kita jajahi, jajahan takluk kita tu, land territory, yang bawah permukaan air, ada natural prolongation, maknanya persambungan bawah aras laut. Jadi tujuan dia kita nak tentukan takat mana natural prolongation tu yang menjadi hak negara berpantai or coastals. So paragraph 1 says that the continental shelf is the natural prolongation of the land territory. Nah, maknanya kalau land tu, landmass kata an island is not part of your territory, maknanya of course you don't own that continental shelf from the island, is not your territory. So the key word is land. You must be is your own land territory. And up to what extent? To the outer edge of the continental margin. Maknanya, another concept of geology that is being used, continental margin. Up to the outer edge of the continental margin. Maknanya, you can define where is the outer edge of the continental margin. Takat mana continental margin kita? Seaward of the land. To the land territory. So that is a concept of geology that is being used to define continental shelf. So dalam kartun ni, you have a continent and a continental margin. We as geologists are very aware. Continent and continental margin. That means margin of the continents bordering the sea. And as I mentioned, if you own this land, is your land territory, the continental shelf, by virtue of you owning the land, then there is a seabed up to a certain point is the natural prolongation of your land territory. It makes sense, right? For the convention. But the problem is for the continental shelf in paragraph 1 of Article 76, where is the outer edge of the continental margin? Sampai mana? Cannot go on forever, right? Because you have to leave some for the benefit, common heritage of mankind. Yang area tadi. That's why it's important to define the outer limit of the continental shelf, so that the coastal state can be sure that, okay, we are going to drill, let's say, drill for oil. Up to where can we go? How much further seaward can we go? That's why all countries are obligated under the convention to define the outer limit. So how far does the continental margin extend? And then I will go back to paragraph 2, but paragraph 3 now defines the continental margin. What is the continental margin? Kita belajar geology, we are taught what continental margin, there's a shelf, slope, continental rise, abyssal plain, and so on. It is also used in Article 76 of the Convention to define the continental margin. So what does it say? Continental margin comprises the submerged prolongation of the landmass. It's about the same as saying that it's natural prolongation of the land territory. But now in the geological sense, it's saying that your landmass, there is a submerged portion of your landmass beneath the sea that automatically becomes part of your land territory, as it were, and you own it. Now, what does the continental margin comprise? Comprise the shelf, slope, and the rise. These are geological concepts, right? The shelf, shallow water, and then the steeper slope, maybe 1 to 4 degrees slope, and then the continental rise, where you have deposition of sediments at the base of the slope. So all well-known geological concepts. And then it says categorically it does not include the deep ocean floor or any oceanic ridges. So what is deep ocean floor should be left for the area with a capital A for the common heritage of mankind. So that is the idea behind it. So then for the purpose of the convention, we need, in order to establish the outer limit of the continental shelf, we need to define where does the outer edge of the continental margin lies. And you will see that it's somewhere within the rise, beyond the slope, but somewhere within the rise, if a rise exists. So here's a common picture, an image in our minds. What is continental shelf? What does it look like? We have a land mass, land area with a shoreline, and then a shelf, continental shelf, and then a continental slope with a steeper gradient and some continental rise at the base of the slope with lots of sediments, and then the abyssal plain. So this is the more or less the shape of continental margin as we know it. Most, say 70% of continental margin will look like this. Of course, there are variations. The width, the gradients may be different. So in geology, almost every continental margin is unique in a sense. So, but a typical continental margin will look something like this. And I will come back to this shape later on. So the purpose of Article 76 is to provide the coastal state with a means to define the outer edge of the continental margin. So that will be the basis to define the outer limit of the continental shelf. You notice there's a big difference between geology and UN Convention on the Law of the Sea with regard to continental shelf. Remember I said the purpose is to define the outer edge of the continental margin, which is somewhere along the rise, somewhere in the rise, if there is a rise in the continental margin. But paragraph 1 of Article 76 just now says that the continental shelf is the natural prolongation of the land territory up to the outer edge of the continental margin. So continental shelf in Article 76 is different from the shelf that we know as geologists. That is a very important key difference between what we may call as legal definition of continental shelf, Pelantar Benua mengikut Undang-Undang Laut, and continental shelf as we geologists know it, Pelantar Benua mengikut geology. So remember this very important difference. So how do we determine the outer edge of the continental margin? Article 76 in paragraph 4 provides two formulas. Ada dua formula untuk menentukan outer edge of continental margin. Sebelum kita apply that formula, kita kena tentukan, we must determine what we call the foot of the continental slope. That means at the base of the continental slope, from the continental slope to the continental rise, there is an area of change in the gradient because the slope has a steeper gradient and suddenly it becomes very gentle as you enter the deep ocean floor. So that change in the gradient, there is a point where there is a maximum change in the gradient, a point of inflection. So that is where we determine the foot of the continental slope. Kaki cerun, kan? Kaki cerun benua. So I highlight this in red, foot of the continental slope, sebab you have to determine the foot of the continental slope first and then apply the formula. There are two formulas. One is measure 60 nautical miles from the foot of the continental slope. So that will become the outer edge of the continental margin. That's one formula, which is this paragraph here. 60 nautical miles from the foot of the continental slope. The other formula is you find if you have sediment thickness that is enough, you can define a sediment thickness point in such a way that the sediment thickness is at least 1% of the distance to the foot of the slope. Maknanya, if you have 1 kilometer of sediment, there will be at least 100 kilometer from the foot of the slope. I will return to the other. Okay, so basically, in order to determine the outer limits of the continental shelf, there are 4 basic steps. One is define where is the base of the slope, and you can see from the typical shape of the margin just now, where there's the junction between the slope, continental slope, and continental rise. That is the base of the slope. And then determine the foot of the slope. That means an exact point. This is done usually mathematically with the software to determine the exact point as the foot of the continental slope. And then apply the formula, either the formula, as I mentioned, the formula of 60 nautical miles from the foot of the continental slope, or the sediment thickness point, which is at least 1% of the distance to the foot of the slope. Then you define the outer edge of continental margin. And only then you will be able to determine the outer limit of the continental shelf. How do we define the outer limit then? Once you get the outer edge of the continental margin, how do you find the outer limit? You have to check that what we call the constraint. That means Article 76 specifies that whatever you define as the outer edge of the continental margin, it must not exceed 350 nautical miles. That means there's a limit to your extended continental shelf. In most cases, it should not exceed 350 nautical miles. Again, the philosophy is to leave something left for common heritage of mankind, for international community. So this cartoon just to show you how we arrive at the base of the slope, all the different steps to determine the outer limit. So if you have a typical margin just now with a shelf, slope, and rise with an abyssal plain, there is a region which is defined as the base of the slope, where there is a big change in the gradient. The slope usually have 4 degrees of gradient, then suddenly you have almost flat. The rise may have like half a degree of gradient. This area is defined as the base of the slope. And then within this area, we need to determine an exact point that is the maximum change in the gradient. And that is called the foot of the continental slope. So that the foot of slope is that particular point within that base of slope region. And now to define the outer edge of the continental margin, we can apply either one of the two formulas. One is the 60-mile formula line, sometimes called the Hepburn formula, after the geologists who proposed the idea to measure 60 miles from the foot of slope, and that defines the outer edge of the continental margin. Or using the sediment thickness formula, sometimes it's called the Gardiner formula because it's based on it's proposed by the Irish submission Gardiner formula. That means if you have data, for example, seismic data, for example, that can prove you have enough sediment thickness in such that the sediment thickness is not less than 1% of the distance. So in other words, if this is S, it should be greater than 0.01 D, the distance to the force. So you can imagine that if you have a margin that has a lot of sediment deposited on the continental margin, you might want to use the sediment thickness formula instead of the just 60-mile formula because it goes further seaward. So in essence, the outer edge of the continental margin now you can define by either one of the two formulas based on Article 76. Depends on the nature of your margin, the geological makeup of your margin. So the outer limits of the continental shelf now is given by paragraph 2 of Article 76 that says it shall not extend beyond the limits just now. I mentioned 350 nautical miles. That is the constraint put on the extended continental shelf. In most cases, 350 nautical miles will apply. And it says here in paragraph 5, shall not exceed 300 nautical miles from the baselines or shall not exceed 100 nautical miles from the 2,500 meter isobar. That's another formula of constraint. If you have data that can show a water depth of 2,500 meters along your margin and measure 100 nautical miles from there, that becomes another constraint. And you can use both and see whichever that gives you more seaward outer limit. And all depends on the nature of your margin. And there is an exception to that it says here that the outer limit shall not exceed 350 nautical miles in most cases, but in cases where some areas, in some geological situation, there is a ridge that comes from your landmass that goes for very long distances offshore, and if you can prove, usually by geological or geophysical information, that submarine ridge, or what we term as submarine elevation, is a natural component. That means it's geologically connected or of the same origin to your landmass. So there's a lot of geological input that goes into this exercise of determining the outer limits of the continental shelf. So just to demonstrate how the constraints is applied, just for the sake of example, if you, in your particular margin, you use the sediment thickness formula to define the outer edge of the continental margin, where the sediment thickness is not less than 1% of the distance to the force. When you apply, say, the constraint, which is 2,500 meters water depth, and measure 100 miles from there, this is called the depth constraint. One type of constraint. So that means if you use this constraint, that means your outer limit becomes at this constraint. So it's a cut-off. Remember, Article 76 says that it should not exceed beyond that limit. That is one constraint. Or you can use the simpler constraint, 350 miles, and sometimes that is called the distance constraint because it's just a simple measure of 350 nautical miles from the baseline, distance constraint. So once you apply the constraint, then your outer edge of continental margin does not necessarily becomes the outer limit because the constraint will cut it off because the convention requires that it must not exceed those constraints, either of the constraints. So then the state can choose which one is more advantageous. Choose the more seaward outer limit. So that is the nature of the exercise to determine the outer limit of the continental shelf. In fact, it's quite simple, but the complexity is for the 21 members of the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf to determine what is the best approach in any given submission by a coastal state. Because all margins are unique in character and it depends on the amount of data that is being submitted by the coastal state, the arguments they make, whether they say, oh, I'm entitled to use this constraint as opposed to this constraint, for example. There are many other complications. But in essence, it's quite a simple exercise. I think this question crop up quite frequently, but once the submission is made, because all is measured, everything is measured from the baseline. So baseline is very important. So once the coastal state determines this is the baseline, this is what is being submitted, and all the distances are measured against the baseline. And once there's already a recommendation by the CLCS, okay, this is your outer limit. And then once it's agreed, going through all the process, once it is agreed, the coastal state is required to lodge the coordinates of the outer limit to the United Nations Secretary General. Once they've done that, it doesn't matter what the sea level will do after that point. So that's why it's important to define the baselines at the beginning. Yeah, according to the convention, is final and binding to the coastal state once they lodge the coordinates. But sea level, I think in our lifetimes, maybe 100 years or so, the sea level will be in terms of meters, right? But it will not affect very much in the way of distance, lateral distances. You know what I mean? Because the sea level is only in the scale of meters, but we're talking about kilometers of distances laterally. But again, once the coordinates have been lodged, that is final and binding. Good question. Thank you. So just to point out that the continental margin, as we know it, geologists, there's a lot of different types of margins, have different geological character and so on. So the complexity for the CLCS job is actually to try to understand all the different margins and how to apply all this simple formula, that very simple, but then all margins have their own unique circumstances, different shapes and geomorphology and so on. And the scientific and technical guidelines of the Commission describes all these different types of margins and how it can be approached by the coastal state as well as the CLCS to determine the outer limits. But one thing that is important for a coastal state that wishes to establish the outer limit is to test itself in a way that, let's say, one margin here, if the outer edge of the continental margin is within the 200 nautical miles, so that coastal state doesn't have to submit any information to extend the limit. They will not have it anyway. So this is called the test of appurtenance. Mana ujian kelayakan lah. Mana if you test yourself, if your continental margin does not lie beyond 200 nautical miles, don't bother doing anything more. You will have the continental shelf up to 200 miles anyway. But if you have a wide margin that extends beyond 200 nautical miles, then you are eligible to submit information to define the outer limits beyond 200 nautical miles. This doesn't come in the picture at all because this is 200 nautical mile. So the maritime boundary between Malaysia and Vietnam, kat Terengganu kan, is less than 200 nautical anyway. So that boundary has nothing to do with continental shelf outer limit. It's just delimitation between two states, an agreement between two countries. Usually international convention specifies or recommend you have median line between the two states. So if you see an area of the sea where there's less than 400 nautical miles, it's usually a median line somewhere halfway for the state to agree. So that's what essentially happened. This exercise only for coastal state that is fronting the open ocean, where you don't have a competing, because you have a competing one, but a bit further away, like South China Sea. China is miles and miles away, right? Yeah, that is territorial dispute. That is about ownership of that feature, whether you want to call it an island or a rock. That's another different argument, but that has nothing, again, has nothing to do with continental shelf outer limit, because it's within the 200-mile anyway. But the contest is about who owns that island or a rock. Totally different matter. Yeah. A little bit about CLCS very quickly. So under the convention, who is going to examine all this data by the coastal state, provided by coastal state, to establish the outer limits? This is the job of the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. So according to the convention, the commission shall consist of 21 members who are experts of geology, geophysics, and hydrography. I think, to my knowledge, even if before I got into this, I didn't know that this thing exists. International law or diplomacy, there is such a body that uses geology to define sovereign rights of coastal state in the maritime space. And 21 members of these scientific experts, and the state party, that means the countries that ratify the convention, they are eligible to nominate someone from the national of the state to be member of the commission. So the commission was formed in 1997, and I must, for the audience here, we have the first founding member, one of the founding members, Datuk Bakar Jaafar, together with us here, in 1997, when the commission was first formed. And Datuk Bakar served for 3 terms, because the commission have an election every 5 years. So Datuk Bakar was elected for 3 terms, and until 2012. And then I was nominated for Malaysia, and I got elected twice until 2023. My term just ended last week. So all in all, we have between us 26 years, a member of the commission for Malaysia. And also, just to point out, although we are Malaysian nationals, we act in our personal capacity when we serve in the commission, because we have to be independent. Because we consider all the submissions from all over the world for all coastal states. So there are rules and procedures that we follow. For example, if the submission of Malaysia were to be considered, then we will be recused from the proceedings of the subcommission. So there are certain rules that must be followed. So what is the mandate of the CLS? What's the function of the CLCS? There are two functions. One is to consider the data and information provided by the coastal state in order to establish the outer limits. And the other is to provide scientific and technical advice to coastal states wishing to establish their outer limits. And this is what you do most of the time. And as far as I know, there has never been a formal application from coastal state for the CLCS to provide advice. Usually what happens is the coastal state will approach individual members or even former members of the CLCS to advise them in their personal capacity. This is the commission, the last commission at the 57th session in March. So the new commission will take over just in July, when they have their first session. So all work has to be done in the United Nations headquarters. So that means we have to be there physically to work on the data and discuss and everything. So in the past 10 years, 2 terms of the commission meets for 21 weeks in 1 year. Almost half a year, 3 sessions a year. So that's why I've been traveling a lot, 3 times a year for 7 weeks each trip to New York. And the 21 members, actually this 20 because 1 seat from the East European state is still vacant because there are no nominations from East European state. So the seats are allocated to different regional groups. So for example, Asia Pacific, is allocated 5 seats. Western Europe and others are allocated 3 seats, and so on. So each state will be able to nominate their candidate. And usually it's in the case of Asia Pacific, as you know, it's very highly contested. For 5 seats, there are usually like 10 or 11 candidates. So there's a lot of lobbying and campaigning going around before the election. And unfortunately or fortunately, in my case, we did not win the last election in 2022. But I think Datuk Bakar will agree with me. We have served between us for 26 years. We have made a strong impact on the CLCS, on our work. Yeah, just to note that Datuk Bakar served for 3 terms and I served for 2 terms. This is the handover. Remember that the permanent mission. Submissions to the CLCS. The convention says where a coastal state intends to establish the outer limits of the continental shelf, it shall submit particulars, that means information of such limits to the Commission with supporting scientific and technical data. So that is essentially what the CLCS does in New York, to examine the supporting scientific and technical data. And over time, even in the last 10 years, I could see that every submission becomes more complicated because there are more and more data. Because technology is improving, so more states is arguing more complicated ways of trying to establish the outer limits by providing more data and so on. So in general, the process is when the coastal state submits to the CLCS will establish a subcommission. Subcommission consists of 7 members. These 7 members will examine one particular submission. Until it's finished, then it goes to another submission and so on. Consider the submission and then issue a recommendation. The recommendation will be by the commission as a whole, the whole 21 members. The recommendation is like a report submit to a coastal state as well as UN Secretary General, and then that will be the basis for the coastal state to establish the outer limits. And once the coastal state agrees and establishes outer limit based on those recommendations, the obligation is to provide the coordinates of the outer limit to the United Nations. Once they did that, then it becomes final and binding. So whatever the sea level is doing or whatever, that it remains. So for the record, this is the of submissions. You can see we have now 103 submissions. And recommendations is about 1/3. Now it's about 38 recommendations. That means there are more submissions than recommendations. In other words, and this is always a criticism by the coastal state, we are not working fast enough. The CLCS is not working fast enough. But it's not within our control. It's up to the coastal state. There are many factors that determine how long it takes for the submission to be considered and recommendations to be issued. Malaysia ada 2 submission. Again, there's a complication because there is objection by China, Philippines, and so on. So this is a map of extended continental shelf. At least some of them are still pending, but this is what the global map will look like if, let's say, all these submissions have been approved. You can see the colors. So around the continents, there is the 200 nautical mile, right? So the colors are areas beyond 200 nautical miles that are being claimed by the coastal state. And if you look at the statistics, if you go to the CLCS website, there's a list of submissions and recommendations. It's all public. And what I've done here is to classify all the submissions according to continental margin types. And we are aware as geologists, divergent margins, that means rifted margins or passive margins, convergent margins where there's subduction zones and continental collision, for example, and transform margins. So these types are also defined and discussed in the scientific and technical guidelines of the Commission for the guidance of coastal states. But there is also one class of continental margin which I call oceanic continental margin, which is kind of weird. You can't have a continental margin in the ocean. But for the purpose of the convention, an island out in the ocean in the Pacific, for example, is entitled to a continental shelf, right? And it must have a continental margin. So for the purpose of the convention, there are also at least a quarter of all submissions come from islands, small island states. Fiji, Tonga, all those states. They are very small in terms of land area. They have a 200 nautical mile EEZ, but they're also asking for extended continental shelf based on Article 76 in the convention. And they are well entitled to do that. So the task of the CSAS to consider the data information based on Article 76. So just for the Asia Pacific around the Circum-Pacific region, the blue areas here are the EEZ. The colored area are the extended continental shelf. Some are pending in yellow here. And another important point is what is left is the common heritage of mankind, right? The white area beyond the outer limit. And that is where the International Seabed Authority manages the, for example, seabed mining that a lot of people are talking about. It doesn't belong to any state, but it belongs to all states and managed by International Seabed Authority on behalf. But also, interesting point is that many of these states in the Pacific Islands, they don't have hydrocarbons because, as you know, they are on actually basaltic igneous islands, right? They don't have sediments much in the way of sediments that can generate hydrocarbon. But their resources they're trying to harvest is the seabed mining. And they can do that even within the 200-mile limit because they're right off the island. There's already a seabed or deep ocean seabed with manganese nodules and so on. But also they are entitled to extend their continental shelf beyond 200. Just as a matter of record, it's interesting to see, and I mentioned that the CSAS is always criticized for being slow, not enough recommendations. You can see the record for the 5 terms of the CSAS, there are number of recommendations on the submissions. First term, 1, 2, 15. This is the record. The third term, the last term of Datuk Bakar, 2007 to 2012, we have 15 recommendations issued. And then at that point in 2012, the CLCS started increasing the number of work weeks in New York in order to increase the productivity because the courses have been complaining we are not doing enough. So that was the start of the 21-week work in New York. But look, it's going down. So even then there's argument, there's even suggestion that why not the CSS do this full-time? There should be a full-time body in New York doing this. But this just proves that the number of working week is not really the main factor. It is the complication, the complex submission, the amount of data that are provided by the coastal state, the amount of time taken to consider the data. And also there's different interactions between coastal state. For example, if a certain submission by a coastal state, if there is disagreement as to, for example, the outer limit or the outer edge of continental margin, then some coastal state just try to say, okay, we don't agree with this. Let us come back with more data at the next session. So this could go on for 2 or 3 sessions and will delay the consideration. So these are factors that is beyond the control of the CSA. And these statistics just prove that the number of weeks, the amount of time we spend in New York is not the main factor in controlling the productivity. And you can see over time, this is number of recommendations made to 38. Right? The time of submission to issue of recommendations can be up to 14 years. That means the coastal state, after making submission, have to wait more than 10 years until they get the recommendation. And the queue is increasing. As I mentioned, already 100 over submissions. But actually the time of consideration by the commission is not, the average is about 3 or 4 years, more or less constant, maybe some spike at the end, but constant. So it's more about the complexity of the information given by. So there are 93 submissions. There are partial revised submission. So again, if a coastal state does not fully satisfied with the recommendation, they can provide a revised submission. And under the rules of procedure, the revised submission will take priority to be considered. So they go to the top of the queue again. So that has also an impact on the other people, the other coastal state, waiting for their submissions to be considered, because revised submissions take up their time. So Malaysia has 2 submissions, one at number 33, the one with Vietnam jointly submitted in 2009. And the recent one, 2019 submission, is number 85. I don't foresee within the next, I don't know, maybe 20 years, we ever get to 85. Now we are at number 49. It's still a long way. And you consider if one submission takes about average 7 years, 8 years, when will we get to number 85? And Datuk Bakar will attest this. In fact, in the initial, the drafters of the convention did not foresee that we going to get more than maybe 35 submissions for the whole world. But now we are already past 100. When I went in 2012, they was already predicting it will go past 100 very quickly. Okay, CLCS and disputes. This is what interests most people. For example, why is so controversial about this? So CLCS only deals dispute in this way. If there is an objection, for example, Malaysian submission in the South China Sea, there has been objection by neighboring states like China, Philippines. According to the rules of procedure of the Commission, when there is a dispute, whether land or maritime dispute, the Commission shall not consider or qualify the submission. That's kind of kills everything, put everything on the shelf. And it has been applied more or less consistently since the first submission was made. So although Article 76, paragraph 10 says the consideration of the CS is without prejudice to the delimitation, but the rules of the Commission says that any action by the Commission shall not prejudice. So it kind of put the Commission in a difficult situation. You either, whether you did it, you prejudice one side, or if you don't do it, you also prejudice the other side. It's a very difficult situation, but in order to not complicate the matter, usually the response by the CLCS is just to go by the rules of procedure, because it's clear in UNCLOS, in the convention, that matters of delimitation has nothing to do with the CLCS. It has to do with the agreement between states, and CLCS has no business in determining any delimitation of maritime boundary. So the rules, in terms of the rules of procedure of the Commission, Rule 46 says that in case there is a dispute in the delimitation of continental shelf between opposite or adjacent states, or in other cases of unresolved land or maritime disputes, submissions may be made and shall be considered in accordance with Annex 1 to these rules. What is Annex 1 to these rules? Again, no prejudice to delimitation. But what is Annex 1? Annex 1 to the rules of procedure says that in cases where there's a land and maritime dispute, the Commission may consider one or more submission in the areas under dispute with prior consent given by all states. That means there should not be any single objection by any interested parties. So once there's an objection, the only way to go forward is that all those objections have to be lifted by those states that make the objection. So as far as Malaysia's submission is concerned, we are kind of stuck. And that has to be the job of the diplomatic and political sphere, Wisma Putra and so on. So the general practice of the Commission, as I mentioned, the Commission can only consider a submission if there are no dispute, no objection by any state. Maybe I just show quickly one example. In one example of a recommendation by the Commission. And this example refers to one particular aspect of the Article 76, where in Article 76, paragraph 4, it says in B here, in Remember, the foot of the continental slope is defined as the base of the slope and that particular point where there's maximum change in the gradient. And that is usually the general rule, the most common way to define the foot of continental slope. But Article 76 also provide that there's evidence to the contrary. So in general, if there is absence of evidence contrary, you define it by this maximum change in the gradient. But if you have evidence, usually in form of geological evidence or geophysical evidence, that the foot of continental slope is not necessarily at the point of maximum change in the gradient. And that has been used by Argentina in their submission. In fact, this is the first set of recommendations made in accordance with this provision of using evidence to the contrary. That means the foot of the continental slope is defined based on geological evidence, not based on maximum change in the gradient. Why is it important? As you know, as we geologists know, there are different types of passive margins, and passive margins have volcanic origin or non-volcanic. And we can see all over the globe, there are areas where there are volcanic passive margins. And one margin in particular, the Argentinian margin here, is a volcanic passive margin. What's so special about it? It has what is often observed in seismic data, the so-called seaward dipping reflectors. So instead of determining the maximum change in the gradient as the foot of continental slope using the bathymetric evidence, Argentina used the seismic evidence to say that the continent-ocean transition is where the seaward extent of the seaward dipping reflectors using seismic data is determined. So you can see the difference between these two approaches, but the convention allows states to use that. So this is the Argentine margin here. This is a 200 nautical mile line. This is the foot of the continental slope. Green points here are based on evidence to the contrary. That means using the seaward dipping reflectors because it is a volcanic passive margin. These yellow points are the foot of the continental slope determined using the general rule. That means the change in the gradient. So the coastal states are able to use a mixture even in one margin, whatever that gives the most advantage. So this is a map of the seaward dipping reflectors all along the margin. You see the seaward dipping reflectors, although it occurs all along the margin, Argentina used only the northern part for the application of geophysical evidence for the foot of the slope, because it's more advantageous to them. So this is the seaward dipping reflectors. And you see, if you are using the maximum change gradient, this would be a more appropriate place to put the foot of the continental slope, right? This is the maximum change in the gradient, steep slope and shallow gradient. But if they can prove with seismic information, the seaward dipping reflectors, so the foot of slope is more seaward. So that's what Argentina has used. As the foot of the continental slope. Again, and also they have used the sediment thickness formula because the margin is heavily sedimented. There's a thick sediment from the seismic here. So they can determine a point outer edge of continental margin based on sediment thickness, which is at least 1% of the distance to the force. So you can see how geologically intensive in some cases, in fact, in many cases, the work of the CLCS is to examine the data. It's not just examine just by looking at it. We have to determine whether the depth, time to depth conversion is done properly. We have to look at the velocity data to determine whether it's really 1 kilometer in thickness, 1% sediment thickness, and so on. I think that's it. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Of the thing, but you can share.
I don't have. Well,
Great.
Malaysia made 2 submissions to the CSS. One in May 2009. It is a joint submission with Vietnam because at the time the agency this does not happen to Malaysia only. There are many other submissions that receive the same fate, that when there is an objection by a third state, the commission, according to the rules of procedure, will not be able to qualify or consider the submission. So that's what happened in 2009. And the submission by Malaysia in 2009 concerns, because it's a joint submission with Vietnam, concerns only in the southern portion of the area beyond 200 nautical miles between Vietnam and Malaysia. And then in 2019, December 2019, the second submission made by Malaysia, which is a unilateral submission, 10 years after. But actually, the submission was already prepared much earlier on. It's because it's the same area. But it was just a decision made that we apportion in one submission, the southern part, and another submission is in the northern part. Why it took 10 years to submit the second one? Maybe there's a lot of factors. Change of government over the last 10 years, if you remember. Change of direction of the administration and so on. So the 2019 submission also received the same objection by China and the Philippines. So I won't go into the details of the objection. All these documents you can view from the CLCS website. You can look at why the China objects, why Philippines objects, and so on. So in fact, the 2019 submission by Malaysia achieved a record by having the most number of note verbals. Note verbals is the communication, formal communication by states. I think the count was 27 note verbals about the submission, mainly the objection of the third states, and then the reply by other states, including Malaysia. And for the Malaysian submission in particular, there was also response by United States, Japan, and so on in supporting Malaysia's submission for a number of reasons. So that's that. I mean, it is what it is. I hope the diplomatic avenue can be reached between the parties concerned. But again, CLCS, according to its rules, would not have the ability to consider.
Okey, terima kasih Dr. Mazlan atas kongsian tadi. Tadi Datuk Yunus sudah mula dengan soalan. So saya baca Doktor soalan yang now currently we have 77 participants. So ada beberapa soalan daripada Pak Chu. The first one, is there any guideline for active margin condition where the sediment is very thin? That's the first question.
Guidelines, there's a guideline. There's a document called the Scientific and Technical Guidelines of the Commission. I think in most instances, the guidelines provide some kind of guidance for coastal state. Most of the, I mean, as I showed, all the types of continental margins are considered in that guideline, whether it's thin sediments or thick sediments. And it all depends what the coastal state want to do. If there's a very thin sediment, maybe it's not enough to use the sediment thickness formula.
The second question from Datuk Fatih Chan. For baseline, do you use the coastline or can you use the islands to be part of coastline? Can Malaysia use the archipelago concept to define the baseline?
I'm not an expert on baselines, but as far as I know, Malaysia uses straight baselines, base points and straight baselines. And that also has been lodged only recently, last year at the United Nations, together with the submission on the outer limits.
Doctor, is it the regulator, jabatan department yang terlibat dalam pengukuran ni, adakah laut ke ataupun JUPAM ke?
JUPAM.
Oh, JUPAM lah.
JUPAM.
So there is one question from our fellow student, Amirul Zahari. What are the uses in industry for these detailed classifications and formulas? So he just curious, the determination of the...
This is a big picture for the coastal state to define the limit of the continental shelf so that the coastal state have the right to explore or exploit natural resources on the seabed. So it's for that purpose. So that there's a certainty. Mana Kita dah tahu ini sempadan kita. Yang lebih pada tu is the area. It belongs to the whole international community. But this is belong to Malaysia or whatever state. That is the whole purpose.
Okay, so Mr. Rushdie ada share podcast yang bertajuk Masa Depan Wilayah Maritim Peranan Suruhanjaya.
Itu podcast interview.
Interview, okay.
Interview.
Alright. And then the rest is Paulius, Nur Kartini, Suryat, Zuraida Mat Isa, Didi Daulip,
Kenal nama-nama.
MK. So they say thanks you for the informative sharing. Okay. So ada persoalan daripada pelajar? Pelajar UKM malu sikit, Doktor. Okay, so yeah, we have one question.
Yeah. Both.
If it was sedimentary pile, then why did they use the other approach?
Because that what we call the seaward dipping reflectors. Right. Yeah. Because the importance of that is that the existence of seaward dipping reflectors provide way to define the continent-ocean transition. Not ancient one, it's present. One criterion to define the continent-ocean transition. Remember, continental margin is actually the margin of continents, right? So what we are trying to look for is the outer edge of the continental margin. So one concept is that the continental margin, the outer edge of the continental margin is somewhere in the vicinity of the transition between continental crust and oceanic crust, or continent-ocean transition. The idea is that when we have seaward dipping reflectors at volcanic passive margin, seaward dipping reflectors is a mixture of volcanics and sediments. And this also indicates that you are close to the continent-ocean boundary. So there is geological evidence used as opposed to bathymetric evidence of the foot of the slope. I'm trying to get back there. Maybe I can. This one? Yeah. Yeah, this is sediment. It's sediment, yes. No, they use, yes, these seaward dipping reflectors, which is the volcanic and sediments above the oceanic crust. This has to do with the breakup of the continents, volcanics at the initial stage of rifting. This is, we are trying to look for the foot of the continental slope, right? Foot of the continental slope, you can easily determine based on the maximum change in the gradient here, yes? So maybe let's say for the sake of argument, this is the point, all right? But in the case of passive volcanic margin, in this case, you can use the seaward dipping reflectors, the presence of these seaward dipping reflectors as a proxy for your continent-ocean transition. So then the Article 17 says you can use this as evidence to the contrary to the foot of the slope based on change in the gradient. So naturally, this would be more advantageous to you, to Argentina, to use this evidence rather than this evidence. Because the whole philosophy is to find where the continent ends, where the ocean begins. Continental margin, yes, passive and volcanic, because you need to have this feature. So non-volcanic passive margin, you will not find seaward dipping reflectors like this, so they won't use it.
So soalan mungkin Cik Khairul boleh unmute Mr. Robin, dia nak tanya soalan.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Nur Shafina, and thank you, Dr. Mazlan, for giving this. You have clarified Article 76 of the law of the sea very, very clearly. Now we understand very well. So thank you very much. Dr. Mazlan, I got a question here. On the Spratly Island claimed by China, China also building artificial island in the South China Sea in Spratly Island. Is it legal? Because Spratly Island from China is 500 batu nautika jauhnya. Itu dah melebihi what we call this the upper limit, the distance constraint of 350 batu nautika. So is it legal for China to build artificial reef to do fishing in the Spratly Island?
Thank you, Mr. Robin.
Oh, ni soalan berapi ni. I say we can take this question privately because I need live. I don't think I want to get into that.
Dr.
Mungkin
Mazlan.
soalan in general kan, area tu is for all human kan kongsi. So adakah semua orang
Dia macam ni. It's a good question, but I don't want to get into it. Well, because it's right, you kata, well, we don't know whether the area is for common heritage of mankind because there's no outer limit defined yet. You only know once you define the outer limit. Then officially that is national jurisdiction of the coastal state and that is the area. So until we do that, we cannot say for sure.
But I think it is obvious, Dr. Mazlan, the Spratly Island is very close to the Philippines, very close to, it's in fact closer to Malaysia, to Vietnam. They have the more right to claim on the Spratly Island rather than China. But as you say, you're not going to discuss about this here.
Yeah.
The second question is, Japan, they do fishing for whales all the way to Australia. Is it legal?
Itu lagi satu question yang susah nak jawab. I'm not an expert in fisheries. Well, I rasa jawapan ni semua ada dalam ni kot. Kalau saya cari pun mungkin adalah boleh faham sikit. Because everything to do with the oceans, fisheries, rights of states and so on ada dalam convention ni. So nak jawab tu susah lah sebab I've not read all the 300 articles here. And also back to your question just now, I think land territory ni dia tak semestinya you based on distance. You can take for example, you have telah French territory in the Pacific. Doesn't mean dia is I don't know how many thousand kilometers from France. Bukan dia punya because it's territory. So the dispute is not because of continental shelf. It's because dispute is territorial dispute. It's a different matter. So yang kita cerita ni continental shelf is about Article 76. It has to do with prolongation of natural prolongation. That means geological. What we can determine from geological information. Lain daripada ownership in terms of territorial ownership of anything.
Okay, Dr. Mazlan, regarding territorial ownership, itu satu penjajahan. So we are not talking about penjajahan.
I don't want to get into this. I don't want to get drawn into this discussion because it's more complicated than it seems. Terima kasih.
Okay, terima kasih Mr. Robin. So Mr. Robin, kalau ada soalan, you can always ask offline sebab kita mahu menjaga keharmonian semua. Okay, so I'm very sure ada banyak soalan lepas ni lah, but you always can ask Dr. Mazlan in private. Okay, so pelajar ada soalan lagi tak? Bukan senang ya nak dapatkan Dr. Mazlan wakil negara kita dekat United Nations.
Ya, tak ada.
Yelah, maksudnya it's been years you represent our country, so datang UKM ni and then share dengan pelajar, mungkin mereka tak nampak lagi signifikan ya student. Ada soalan lagi tak? Dr. Habibah.
Itulah expert in geophysics, geology and hydrography. Yes, why not?
So pelajar di samping tu boleh jadikan sumber inspirasi jugalah, maksudnya yang bercita-cita besar. Ini salah satu career path maksudnya bukan ini bukan biasa-biasalah. Okey. Sebelum tu sebabkan kita ada juga kat sini Profesor Datuk IR Dr. Abu Bakar Jaafar. He's from UTM Ocean Thermal Energy Center. So macam saya cakap kat Datuk tadi, I'm not from this oil field, so I need to learn more. So maybe Datuk boleh share sikit.
Okay, terima kasih. One of the main motivations I have to come here because I want to catch up with Dr. Mazlan. So actually, I'm very happy. Actually, I learned something new also. evidence to contrary been applied lah, which is to me is new lah. I think to pick up our friend's question just now, yeah, I think the answer is why the Argentina used the evidence, right? It's basically what you said in the last sentence lah, Doc, because the idea of to determine the outer edge of the continental margin, you have to really find out where the continent ends, where the ocean begins. I think that's the keywords. I think the maximum change gradient just I would say artificial, very artificial concept lah. But I think this concept evidence theory is, I would say, more real, more realistic. That gives the advantage to the state. Okay, ocean thermal energy. Okay, if you are Muslim, you should be familiar with Surah An-Nur verse 40, right? That's the knowledge. This knowledge has been revealed in Al-Quran, right? It's something to do with the energy from the sun, right? It goes to the atmosphere, it becomes wind, goes to the cloud, becomes hydroelectric, and it hits the surface of the ocean, become waves, and it goes further inside, become current, and then the sunlight only penetrates up to certain depths. So the upper layer, you have this warm water, and then since the light cannot penetrate deeper, so the bottom layer part of the ocean is cold. So we have warm water at the top and cold water at the bottom. So ocean thermal energy technology essentially to extract the heat from the top and then to convert this heat into power and convert into green hydrogen. So the trick is if you are using this ammonia to extract the heat, liquid ammonia, right? Once the liquid ammonia exposed to warm water becomes gas that runs, turns the turbine, turns the generator, you get the power. So the trick is how to cool down the gas back to liquid. Then we need to pump the cold water from the bottom, right? So the idea is to keep pumping the ammonia liquid through the heat exchanger in order to continue to extract the heat. So in short, ocean thermal energy conversion is simply extraction of the heat from the ocean, especially in the tropics, right? And convert into power. And since this extraction in the middle of the ocean, so it doesn't make sense to transmit the power to the land. So we use the power through electrolyzers to convert this power into green hydrogen. And then we just put the green hydrogen in containers and ship them out, just like we ship out the LNG. So this is a subject. So if you go back afterwards, you open Surah An-Nur, verse 40. They will tell you the whole story. Yeah. So that's in short. That answers it. Right? Is it clear?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Yunus, ada apa-apa? Ada.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Saudara-saudara sekalian, saya tak ada apa nak tambah kecuali saya nak beritahu bahawa bidang ini bukan boleh kita memadai kita belajar dalam classroom saja. Dia memerlukan research yang banyak, memerlukan pembacaan yang banyak, dan kita Malaysia negara kecil tapi kita bangga kerana sejak daripada mula CLCS kita ada dua komisioner kita, Datuk Bakar dan juga Dr. Mazlan. Kemudian jabatan saya dah pencen lah. Jabatan Minda dan Jurusan memang terlibat bersama-sama dengan JUPEM dan juga banyak lagi agensi TLDM dan AGC dan serta lain untuk buat kajian, bukan buat kajian, kemudian merumuskan dan bersama-sama menyediakan submission, dua submission. Submission yang pertama tu semasa saya masih berkhidmat lagi, submission yang kedua setelah saya bersara dah. Macam mana pun data-data itu yang digunakan dan kajian ini adalah satu kajian yang mencabar seperti mana kata Dr. Mazlan tadi, to digest and to absorb what is in between the UNCLOS Commission, UNCLOS book is something not easy to digest it. Jadi sekali lagi saya sebutkan bidang ni adalah bukan bidang yang boleh kita hanya belajar dalam classroom, kita kena explore dan kita kena cari sendiri. Thank you.
Saya nak tambah sikit boleh? Okay, semasa saya di MKN, kita kena buat survey asal macam nasi bersama dengan Datuk Yunus dengan Dr. Mazlan. Survey tu 2006, 2008. So masa tu principal scientist kita Dr. Vijay lah. Dia punya director. Dia telefon saya. Dia kata, Datuk, budak ni tak berani lah pergi ke utara. Sebab dia takut Chinese Navy potong streams. You know, seismic survey streams. So dia kata, ni kita punya kapal ni banyak lagi masa lagi nak buat apa? Ha? Dia tanya saya. Dia kata, baguslah. You cuba cari survey apa suhu di dalam laut, terutama di depan negeri Sarawak, Brunei dan Sabah. Dia panggil Sabah Trough ataupun North Borneo Trough atau North West Trough, sometimes they call it Palawan Trough. So masa itulah saya tahu suhu di trough tu 4 darjah C. Sebelum ni saya agak mungkin paling rendah 10 lah, tapi 4. Sama juga suhu bawah ais dekat Artikel lah. So pada masa tu saya lapor kepada Jawatankuasa Pelantar Benua, pengurusi dia Datuk Muhammad Hatta lah. So dia cakap dengan saya, perkara ni saya kena bawa ke Mosti. Tapi dalam pada itu pun Jawatankuasa ni dia namakan 2 pegawai daripada Petronas to take up the subject lah. Ya. Maknanya masa tu kita dah tahu kita ada potensi untuk mengeluarkan tenaga daripada laut dalam kita, ocean thermal lah. Kemudian ni cerita panjang lah. So 2008 saya bagi taklimat kepada Kementerian Sains, Teknologi dan Inovasi. Masa tu pengurusi dia ialah Datuk Fadilah Yusof. Now our Timbalan Perdana Menteri sekarang lah. So dia arah kepada bekas Naib Chancellor UMT Datuk Norani. Masa tu dia pengarah laut lah di Mosti. So tahun 2009 saya tanya dia, berapa banyak dapat duit bajet? RM10 je. RM10 token. Tapi kalau dia kata government kata RM10 tu maknanya positif lah. Ya, maknanya you kena kerja kuat lagi, minta come up with good proposal, fight lagi dapat bajet. Tapi lepas itu perkara tu matilah. So 2009. So hari terakhir saya di New York 16 Mei 2012. Masa tu Naib Chancellor Universiti Teknologi Malaysia Datuk Seri Zaini, dia ada kat New York. So dia panggil saya minum pagi. So dia cakap dengan saya, tu you dah habis kat New York ni, you kena join UTM dan tubuhkan pusat ni lah, Ocean Thermal Energy Center. So saya telah berada di UTM semenjak 1 Jun 2012. Saya jumpa dia 16 Mei. 1 Jun 2012 saya terus bekerja di UTM lah. So perkara ni dah 10 tahun lah. Sekarang projek ni masih belum berjalan lagi lah. Tapi prospek banyaklah sekarang. Sekarang government dia dah keluarkan dasar tenaga kebangsaan kan 2020-2040. So dalam dasar ni ada disebut potensi tenaga laut dalam daripada ocean thermal lah. So I have to continue to work lah. Saya masih lagi bekerja di UTM. Although Mazlan dah pencen, tapi dia kena tak boleh pencen lah kan. So kita kena tenaga, banyak tenaga lagi.
Kita boleh link dengan teknologi hydrogen car.
Betul. Okay. I'm glad you mention about hydrogen car. Sekarang kalau you tanya banyak pakar-pakar kereta ni, dia kata hidrogen masih mahal. Kata mahal macam mana? You kata mahal. Dia tak boleh jawab. Okey. Sekarang harga hidrogen RM28 1 kilogram. Sekarang. Dia kata mahal. Tapi hari tu saya buat kira-kira 1 kilogram hidrogen masuk dalam Toyota Mirai boleh pergi 245 kilometer. So 1 kilometer berapa sen? 11 sen kan? Betul tak? Lebih kurang kan? RM28 bagi 245 lebih kurang 11 sen. Ini just operational ya. Kereta sama lah. Kereta sama. Now, kalau RM20 you beli RON 95, you dapat 13 liter. 1 liter kata apa? You pergi 10, 12 kali 13, paling banyak you boleh jalan 150 kilometer. Banyak beza kan? 245 dengan 150. So kalau you orang minyak, then you takut lah. Betul tak? This is a potensi tentang ocean thermal energy. Ocean thermal energy 26,000 megawatt. 10 kali lebih besar daripada bakun. Right? So kalau you convert dari 26,000 megawatt pada green hydrogen, dia punya gross revenue 27 billion US per year. So Petronas punya revenue apa? Mazlan? Tengok. 100 million maybe ya. Ringgit, this one billion. Tu sampai billion times nak sampai 5 dah kan. Satu US now sampai 5 dah, 4.65 ringgit dah. So 100 billion ringgit. So there's another aspect. Tapi we need geologists for this project. You know why? We need to anchor the faulting platform to the continental slope. So we need the geological knowledge to anchor this. There are other also. We need other knowledge also now. So this, you're thinking to be involved in this ocean thermal energy project. You've been thinking about to study the continental slope and see what kind of rock we can anchor the vessel. So that's a good prospect lah. Sorry lah tambah ya. Saya kalau mula cakap sampai pukul 3 pagi lah. Terima kasih.
So terima kasih kepada Datuk Yunus dengan Datuk Bakar, dan sekali lagi kita berikan tepukan gemuruh kepada ketiga mereka lah. Okay. So sebagai tanda penghargaan, kita jemput Ketua Program Geologi, Dr. Rozi, bagi menyampaikan cenderahati kepada penceramah hari ini. So dengan ini berakhirlah sesi ceramah teknik kita pada hari ini. Untuk mereka yang online mungkin boleh gambar, ambil every page Okay, 1, 2, 3. Berapa page? Dah habis tak? 2 je?